Hi, everyone. It's Lauren Clark, President and CEO of Bridge C14. Thanks for tuning in to the Bridge C14 podcast. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by Ngaio Davis to talk about her work in the death care and funeral industry and how MAiD has helped to shape and shift the work that she does to support individuals through dying and death, and to support those who are around them through their own grief experience. Would you mind telling our listeners just a little bit about yourself?
Hi, Lauren. Thanks so much for having me. So my name is Ngaio Davis, and I am the founder and I guess principal owner of a funeral business, Deathcare business in Vancouver, British Columbia, called KORU, Cremation Burial Ceremony. I am a licensed funeral director and embalmer, and I've been in funeral services for probably 20 or so years, and in the last 8 years have been on my own and like to kind of distinguish between funeral services and death care services.
So can you talk to us maybe a little bit about what some of those differences are, maybe?
Yeah, so for me, funeral services has come to be something that is known as being something quite conventional and often traditional, and language becomes a really interesting thing around anything to do with death and dying. And a lot of times people will hear the word funeral and they will think of a ceremony with the body present, with people there, perhaps the casket is open, could be closed, and there are very kind of, I would say, kind of traditional rituals and practices that go along with that. And so our industry has become known as the funeral industry because much of our practice was around looking after services in that way when someone died. But as things have changed over time and people become more transient, requests are different, the connections to community, faith community, just your own cultural communities has changed. I've noticed that there's just a different way in which people are wanting to be able to honor someone who's died without it being a funeral. And so when we say death care services, we want people to know that we are looking after the dead, looking after their physical care, and then any services that go along with that. And that includes looking after the survivors as well. So for us, it's just a much broader and a more inclusive title, I guess you could say.
Absolutely. And I think it's a very interesting way of sort of approaching, that death experience in so many ways. So thank you for that. What have you noticed when supporting individuals choosing MAiD, and sort of what that experience is like in terms of what they want for their death care?
Yeah. Interesting. So I've noticed that people seem to, I've noticed about 3 different things that really stand out. And the first is that people seem to fall into a couple of different categories. And I'm being broad here, so there are always exceptions. But one is that the person who's choosing MAiD has already a really good existing support group around them, whether that's family, friends, other professionals. And with that support, there is the security and comfort to really be able to do some thoughtful planning around everything that's going on for that decision to die on a certain day at a certain time, and with the assistance of the medical profession. And then the other group seems to be people who don't have those really strong support groups ahead of time. And I find that their journey with MAiD seems to be more last minute. There's not as much planning. And there certainly aren't the ceremonies and gatherings taking place. So there's some really distinct differences there. The other thing that I noticed is and this was kind of more early on when MAiD was becoming when MAiD was first offered and just becoming something that people were understanding was a choice. But there was this real big degree of secrecy around the choice and the event itself. I still feel that, but it's not as acute as it was earlier on. And then the third thing I've noticed is the deep emotional struggle for the survivors of the person who has chosen MAiD. And even if they've had notice, which not all survivors have noticed ahead of time, there's really this kind of shell-shocked look in their eyes, trying to grapple with what has just happened or what is about to happen. And again, that was really evident in the early days when MAiD was first being offered. And I still see it from time to time now, but not as much, so that there's improvement there.
And maybe on that note what would you say is the reason for that shift in some ways? Is there something that you can pinpoint as to why some are less sort of shell-shocked, as you say, or you're noticing it less? Do you think it's just the shift in society's views on MAiD, our sort of appreciation or understanding, a better appreciation or understanding for what's going on? Or do you think the system itself has just improved to be able to better support these individuals?
I think it's really the latter, that the system is improving, and thankfully, and in a much needed way. I would love to be able to say that as a society we're starting to change on that, but I don't think we have really, as a whole group, come that far just yet. I think it's coming. And as more people are doing it, and doing it in a really kind of gentle and beautiful way, it will help others. But I really do think that it's the healthcare system making the changes internally to offer better support for everybody, not just the patient choosing MAiD.
Okay. And certainly that's something we've noticed at Bridge C14 as well. And for some, and sometimes it's based in the province that you live or even the community, and some are sort of stronger in having those conversations or sort of doing more preparation. And I think you touched on that is some who feel prepared. And you can only be so prepared, obviously, with what is about to happen or those decisions and what this all looks and feels like. But often what we hear is the more preparedness that's offered in terms of direction and guidance ahead of time really helps in terms of navigating certainly the day of, but also those initial phases after the death and sort of that acute grief phase, and just that ability to sort of process that in a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. Yeah, so important.
Absolutely. And what would you say, with MAiD, has this shifted the work that you do?
Yeah, interesting question. So I think for me, it really reinforced the need for just continued provision of education and information to everybody, honestly, because we never know who amongst us may be choosing MAiD. And even though MAiD has a very kind of special place in the whole medical system and death system, there's an underlying commonality that we all have when it comes to having conversations about death and dying, or dying and death. And so for MAiD, I've just seen that it's just that much more important that we keep kind of forcing people to have conversations, to encourage people to have conversations, to be creative in how we bring up those conversations, and for all of us who can to share as much information and resources about dying and death and MAiD.
Absolutely. I've always said it's sort of the elephant in the room, and it takes someone sort of drawing that elephant out of the corner and saying, it's here, we should talk about this, and here's the importance of why we want to talk about this, and what the benefits of it are. And I know it's not a conversation that makes people feel comfortable, but sometimes it's about having those more uncomfortable conversations that you really garner some really deep reflective responses from people, and they process things in a different way.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's there's so much opportunity around just this really deep topic, isn't there?
Oh yes, definitely. And as you said, it's evolving and it's becoming, less, people are less trepidatious around it, but there still is that holding back in so many respects. And I think even when it comes to the grief experience, and that, what people often say is that anticipatory grief is the hardest to sort of manage, in particular when it comes to MAiD related losses. And I wonder if you could speak to that at all around what you've seen, maybe some of those differences or even similarities between those who are grieving a MAiD loss and those who have experienced another kind of loss.
Yeah, there's kind of a common feeling that's expressed by the survivors of those who've experienced someone close to them dying by MAiD, and that is just the surrealness of like to know, to anticipate not only that the person is going to die, but that there's this day and the time, and that seems to really be quite I'm even having difficulties finding the right words to express for them, and I think that just kind of speaks to it. Like, it's just so bizarre that we know this, and we don't have many other things in our lives to compare that to, other than negative kind of things. Like people on death row. That would kind of be a thing that people might think of in their minds, and yet this is so different. And compared to others who their person is actively dying and they see the end is coming, but there's still that great unknown. And so that while there's still a level of profoundness when the death happens, somehow it seems like we're better equipped to deal with the mystery, that yes, we know what's going to happen, but we don't need to know all the details. And we seem less able to kind of really process that we've got a day and a time. And those are the things that stick out for me.
Absolutely. And that's something that, I've certainly experienced. And as you say the word surreal, my professional experience in this has always, each time that I've stood at the bedside and processed things later, it's to say this is very surreal. And, and I think that's the biggest thing, is that this isn't what we've learned about death, right? And dying. And this isn't what we grew up knowing about, this is not the way things are supposed to go. And I think that's wrapping our mind around that, while you're also, providing care and being a strong caregiver and grieving those losses along the way. And then, as you said, it's that countdown, and that, it's been framed as a parade of lasts. Everything, this is the last time we're going to do this, and the last time for this. And I think that finality of it all is certainly something that, it's more tangible than other losses, right? And other types of death. And so I think that's what people really struggle with, is the actual reality of what is happening or what has happened, right? Yeah.
And I sometimes wonder how much of our typical reaction to death and our grief is to protect us, to try and mitigate the rawness of it all. And with MAiD, we kind of don't get to mitigate that so much. It's just right there in your face initially, and then everything else happens. But
exactly. And I think it makes such a difference when people feel supported through each phase as well. And as you talked about, those who don't have those supports built in, and, or those who are supporting someone choosing MAiD who doesn't have their own network that they can tap into. I think there's certainly some struggles in terms of how do they sort of navigate all of these mixed emotions that are coming up, and those feelings of, is this normal? What I'm feeling, is this actually normal? And, because we don't all know someone with lived experience, right? And if that we can check in and say, was this how it was for you? And I think, that could be the biggest thing, is just feeling so alone in that grief.
Yeah, it can be really heartbreaking in our work. And I felt that with a few clients. We had one gentleman not too long ago who is a well-regarded, highly educated person and still active in academic world, and had a condition that was forcing him to think about what his active dying state would look like, and considering MAiD. And even though he was so well-regarded and well-loved, it was like we were the only people he could talk to about it. And there was just so much fear and shame and loneliness and isolation. And it was heartbreaking to hear that in him, and to, feel that for him. Wondering what was, so providing information to him, but ultimately, we were not able to be that involved with how things went for him. And those are difficult cases to encounter.
Absolutely. And they challenge, the role that we play in all of this, and what we're able to give, and sort of what some of those boundaries are and restrictions that we have, or our limitations as well. And it's such a fine line and a delicate balance, right? To find that. And sometimes we're able to meet those needs, and other times we feel that sort of teeter-totter back and forth. Right. And it's, how do we regain, or help individuals to find that sense of control and empowerment again, and identify, who their new identity is in so many ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's an interesting concept, that it becomes a new identity.
Mm-hmm. Now, what would you say have been sort of the biggest takeaways in the work that you do in the MAiD space?
Yeah, one of them for me is to encourage all of us, particularly those of us in the death care sector, funeral industry sector, to really examine our own personal bias around MAiD, what that means to us, and then work to make sure that there are no negative outcomes to families that we look after. And I say that because I know very early on, and it still is happening today, that there are some funeral businesses who are kind of not stepping up to the plate to just embrace people and look after them, regardless of the request and the event being made. So I think we all need to just have that lesson of step back if you feel like you're bringing your own personal whatever into your work. We really can't let that happen. And if you can't do it, you need to be able to pass that work on to someone else. And I think, again, it comes back to education, and just educating other professionals who are going to be involved in and affected by those who choose MAiD. And I've seen and listened to, when talking to the person who's about to have MAiD, that there's just this real appreciation for the agency that we have here in Canada to make our own decisions about our lives, about our health, and about our end of life. And people are expressing how glad they are that they don't have to travel outside of their community or outside of their province or outside of their country to go somewhere else to be able to have this kind of procedure done. So those are pretty important and I think just privileged places for us to be in with this opportunity.
For sure. And I've certainly felt that level of appreciation, and it's just this understanding in some ways that it's difficult for everyone, right? Everyone who's involved, it's never easy. It's how do you find your place in that and sort of take that step back and reflect on what that experience is like from any side that you're sort of sitting on around that, either that being that person who's choosing, someone who's supporting, or for the sort of the team that's around, and how do we approach that in a way that make sure that we respect that autonomy and dignity and choice, and never sort of put our own, as you said, put our own biases on things, and make people then question their own, is this something that I should be doing? Or, can I actually effectively talk to someone out there without feeling judgment or stigma? And we know that that exists in the MAiD space. I think there's been improvements in that way, but we know that there are still those sort of institutions or organizations or places that people go to who do hold very strong views around this. And it really does leave people with this sort of this sense of, okay, where am I supposed to go now then? And how am I supposed to feel about this?
Yeah, exactly. And that they somehow need to shroud their decision in secrecy so that they're not feeling ostracized by it. We can't ever I think relax that vigilance, right? That we need to make sure that we're always providing clear, accessible information and education to people, and correcting language. When I hear people say that, what is the term? Say it, doctor-assisted suicide. Just putting the word suicide in there. I'm always trying to correct that, just so that people think about that and understand that there's a big difference here.
Absolutely. I think that is one of those teachable moments that we sort of have to hone in on and really encourage, others who hear those sort of terms being used. And you are right, it's so different, but those are some of those misconceptions that then, if that's what's out there and someone is sitting there with that idea of what an assisted death being like, well, no wonder they're scared to talk about it or think some way about it. And again, that education is so key, and it starts on all levels, right? And I think that's as we increase our grief literacy and death literacy in society, I think that helps. But it's also who's having those conversations, and what is that messaging that's being given, and is it being done sensitively, or is it being done in sort of fueling some of these myths and misconceptions even further?
Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Are there one or two things that you feel are sort of most important for our audience to know today, whether that be about the work that you do, the sort of that death care sort of perspective on things, or just some really things that are that you feel are most vital for our audience to know?
Yeah, so one of them I would say is to don't stop all of your planning with MAiD just to the MAiD, if that makes sense. So like to plan beyond that. And I say that because it's happened over and over again, where there's been a lot of thought put into the days leading up to and then that day of the MAiD provision, and then almost no thought put into what will happen once the person has died, and what happens with their body, and then what are those choices, and what else should we know to be able to help the survivors and to properly look after the person who has died. So to really be cognizant of both spectrums, I guess, of planning around that. And I think there's some really incredible opportunities if you're able to be in that mode of really planning so many details just for the MAiD to happen. that to be able to extend that to the gatherings and the ceremonies that could be a part of it, whether that's beforehand or at the time of MAiD, and or afterwards. So that's one thing I would encourage people to do. And this is something that I didn't think I would say. I had written down something else in answer to this, but I also think that many people have misconceptions about the importance of a will. And we find that a lot of people believe that a will is good if you have assets and things to disperse and to deal with. But if you don't really have a lot of money, or things are joint and the estate settling is going to be easy, there's no point in having a will. But for us in the death care and funeral industry, if there's no will, there's nobody appointed to look after and be responsible for all of the death care work that needs to go on. And sometimes that can lead to some really unforeseen complications and some really big delays. And we've noticed this particularly around those who, going back to that first group of people I talked about, who didn't have many support groups around them to begin with. And then compounded by they don't have a lot of assets, so they felt there was no need to have a will, but they had some assets, didn't have a will, had a best friend who they hoped would be able to help out, but because of the way our laws work in BC, and I know other provinces will have their own way, it meant that their cremation, their burial couldn't be looked after for weeks after they had died because of all of the other hoops and government entities that had to be consulted first. And so I found it so jarring, and I still find it jarring when there's planning for this lead up to this day of when the death will happen, and then nothing after that. So that's one of my biggest pleas out there for people to just consider that other side of it. And I've even had palliative doctors, when I've been having this discussion about MAiD, I've had palliative doctors say, oh, well, you know, that person is not here anymore, they're dead, so it doesn't really matter. And I find that appalling. And, you know, I don't know if it's a bias because I work with the dead and the survivors of the dead so much, but I really feel passionately that we all deserve, regardless of our financial status or social status in life, our bodies all deserve to be looked after in a caring and timely manner. And so that's one of my big things that I'd love to pass on to people.
And I think that that's something we almost don't talk about enough, right? And part of that, you know, advanced care planning. But as you mentioned, you can plan for, you know, and we do see people planning up until the moment of the death. And I recall somebody saying to me once, we knew what to do, and then after it was over, I just kind of sat there and didn't know what to do next because I really hadn't thought about that. And I thought, oh my goodness, you know, and then trying to manage all of that. And as part of the grieving after a death, there's also these administrative or business-like tasks that are, you know, inherently built in. And I think that's sometimes that shift between business and grief and business can be really hard to sort of focus on if you're not ready. Or like you said, if those things aren't in place, and then you're sort of fighting afterwards and, you know, expending all of this energy trying to figure out how to get things back on track, right? And if you take the time ahead of time to plan, as you say, after death care, what does that look like and feel like? And for sure, it's something that I think we all need to sort of introduce those conversations and much earlier on than doing it sort of last minute. I'm always about, let's be proactive about things versus having to be reactive, because there's so much else that we would rather you focus on, that, if you can take the time there, it really does make such a difference. And you're right, it's that dignity, both in living and in death, right? And that, what do we carry forward with us? And absolutely to think of it as, well, they won't, what do they care? They're not here anymore. Well, actually, that there's still a person, and they're still, they still hold on to that identity. It doesn't mean poof, everything's gone and we just move on. And I think that that's part of that difficulty sometimes that I've certainly noticed in individuals feeling comfortable enough to have these conversations with sometimes their healthcare team, whether that's leading up to or even afterwards, and disclosing it to others, because they have this notion that, okay, everybody is going to think about things like that, or think these things of me or of that person who chose, and do I need to justify or validate sort of why they made that decision? And what a challenging place to be. And, that's part of the work that we're doing, is trying to have that opportunity to build those connections in that safe and supportive way. But it does take so much more than just, our organization or the work that you and the, in the death care and funeral industries are trying to do. And I think it's for all of us to take that responsibility on. But it's going to take some key people to really sort of poke the bear, so to speak, and say, what, we need to make sure that this is part of end of life planning, right? And that death care planning.
Sure. That's so well said. And just, that to recognize that all the different sectors need to come together, right? The healthcare system and the death care system, and we all have information that we can share back and forth that will just help all of us, including the patients and the bereaved, at the end of it all. So it really does require a village in this case to make this all happen well.
For sure, that community of practice, right, is so important. And the community, I think with MAiD, it's a very unique community, and I think there is more interplay and overlap between all of the sectors. And for so long, I think we've sort of approached things very siloed. And I think to move out of those silos and say, we can all support one another, right? It's not just, this group talks about this and this group talks about that. I think we all have our expertise in certain ways, but I think we can better inform the whole system and process in general than just looking at things with such, those blinders on and only focusing on what we know. I think that informing others in that community of practice helps to strengthen the community around individuals choosing and individuals supporting or grieving that loss.
And there's some great work that's been done. You've noticed it, I'm sure. I've noticed it over time, and so I'm very hopeful that we're going in the right direction. And it's a big boat to try and swing around and navigate, but we're going there. So that's just such an uplifting feeling.
For sure. I think the future is very bright, and I'm really hopeful. And I think, for those of us who have sort of been in the MAiD space, particularly from sort of those early days to where we are now, it's phenomenal to see how we have shifted conversations and shifted how we help to navigate or engage individuals in sort of looking at things differently. But that what you've created now, we know that we've got to continue to develop and strengthen and hone in on how do we best, what are the best practices, so to speak, and how do we best enhance what we are doing, and how do we make it better? And I think we can always do things better.
I was just thinking that, and it behooves us to be open ourselves as the professionals in this space, to be continually learning and just wanting to understand, like you said, how do we make things better, and be open to knowing that it always has to be better.
For sure. And I think, we have to be able to be critical of ourselves and how we have done things. And I think it's conversations like this and our ability to share and connect with one another, but also to sort of inform our audience wherever you're coming in from, whatever lens you have on, that this work is being done. And I think we need to highlight sometimes what we are all doing, and how do we kind of take that and move that forward in a really positive direction. So, I think
my last... well suited to your work.
Oh, I love what I do. And I've always said I could talk about MAiD all day, because I think it's really become, certainly for me, one of the best things that I ever sort of got my toes dipped into, and I think it landed on my lap for a certain reason. And for me, it's just, watching connections grow and develop and build and have that place where people feel safe and supported, especially when they don't feel safe and supported in their own lives. And if we can create that, and have them find that place where they realize they're not alone, I think that's always the hardest thing. And you touched on that as well, is seeing people feel like that there's nobody that they can trust. And how do we sort of ensure that they have good supportive connections outside of what we are able to, ourselves, or in the work that we do, what we can provide, and make sure that those connections and resources are available, right? And they're timely and they're accessible. I think we're getting there, but absolutely, it's, the ball's rolling, and I see it going in the right direction, that's for sure. Is there anything else that you feel is sort of that would be important to share with our listeners today? You've certainly covered such an immense amount of topics that I think some are shy to talk about. And I say, as we always say, it's kind of, who really wants to talk about death and dying and what this all means, and sort of the harder side of things. But I think it's, we need to have these conversations. So I wonder if there's anything else that you feel, if you could impart on our listeners today.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll just finish with like a couple of little anecdotes in a way to highlight some of the opportunity I mentioned around really being able to be thoughtful in your planning, if you're planning for yourself, for your own death. And one of the things that I've had to adapt to is just that, so, usually we're contacted when a death has already happened, and then ceremony stuff is being talked about and planned. And with MAiD, it's like we do everything first, and then the death happens, and then there's less for us to do because a lot of stuff has already been looked after, particularly on the ceremony side. And it doesn't happen in every MAiD circumstance. But there's been a few that have really stood out in my mind, and I want to just share them briefly, hopefully as a way to inspire others to think about what they could do around their own planning or for someone else. And one was a woman who wanted to be able to be outside and her own outside space at her home was not the ideal space. It was in a urban setting, and she wanted to be more in the trees and in the outdoors. And I was able to help navigate one of our metro park systems and ask permission to be able to have her taken to a local park and have a setup that was offered privacy for her and her people, and also some privacy for the other users of the park who didn't know what was going on, but of course would still be using the park. And they spent, so the person who had chosen MAiD and then her group of people that she wanted with her spent several hours together before the doctor and the nurse arrived to look after the MAiD provision. And in that time, I wasn't with them the whole time, of course, but I just had looked after the planning and the setup. But I could hear laughter. They brought all kinds of pillows and mattresses and blankets, and they brought cuttings of things, like flowers from their gardens. And they had snacks and they had food, and it was like their last kind of picnic time together in a spot that she was just delighting in, could hear the river, could see the trees, and she was just with the people she held dearest to her. And after several hours, and when the doctor came, MAiD was provided, and then we were quietly just looking after the body, and her family and friends left. But it was just so incredible that somebody could choose a spot and the day and time and all of the, what would be happening leading up to that moment, and seem to be in a real state of peace. And that, for me, just really stood out, that there wasn't anxiety and fear that was overwhelming the situation. And I've had others who've also done things, but on a much smaller scale, but it was still really in keeping with who they were. So I remember one other fellow, again, we did it in a park outside, but we went early in the morning so that we weren't going to be interfering with the other park users as much. And they had shots of scotch. They got to look out at the space where he did a lot of sailing when he was a really active and competitive sailor. And it was really simple. It was really quick. They didn't spend hours like my other client had done, but it was meaningful. It was so him, as his friend said. There were only two of them there. And there was just this kind of feeling of awe that despite all of the difficulty and stress and everything he'd been under with his illness, that this is how he got to end it. And they loved that for him, and he loved that he got to do that. So very different kinds of ways to plan it. And we all have this opportunity to do things for ourselves and for those who are going to be so impacted when we're looking at MAiD.
Wow, those are, that just, to me, it's kind of, you get this feeling as you just talked about that, and you can sort of put yourself there and think, what a way to celebrate life and death and living and dying, and still maintain that dignity and honor of who that individual is and was, and what they wanted that moment to look and feel like. And I think, if that's one thing that I have also taken away from my MAiD experiences, is really, some put a lot of thought into those final sort of hours or moments, and others don't. And I think it's interesting to see, what people want and what individuals don't, and where they're at in that. But one thing that I've always said is, I have never planned so many pizza parties, or seen so many flowers, the smell of fresh flowers, and that laughter, as you talk about. And people say it must be so depressing to do this. And you think it's not, because it's so different, and absolutely it's hard, and death is not easy, and we don't want to look at this in a callous way at all. But I think there's just this, with MAiD, there's a different approach and a different feeling to it. And people will describe it as, I've heard it described as beautifully traumatic and also traumatically beautiful. And I think there are elements of that. And I think it's how do we shape those experiences? And when people have these experiences, how they then process what they've borne witness to, right? And what they participated in, and how wonderful it can be. And we know that that's not always the case. And I think that these are, when we hear about individuals who had those moments, and it sounds like those were exactly what they wanted. I think it just means so much, right? And I think that to me is why I continue to do the work I do. And I imagine it's something that empowers you to continue supporting and guiding and helping to facilitate something that, not everybody wants to think about or talk about, but, when we need to, I think doing it in a way that approaches it with such respect. I think it's incredible. And the fact that, they were able to be outside in the trees and that you were able to arrange that, in a city park. I think that's what we want this to be, right? Is all about that choice and what does death look like to you, and what would you like that MAiD event to be, right?
Yeah, for sure. Oh, there's so many things we could talk about, but
absolutely. Well, I hope that you'll join us for another podcast. I've loved having this conversation with you. I think you've given me a lot of things to reflect on in my own work that I do. So I imagine that, anyone listening to this, that there's so much that they can take away from how you sort of described the challenges, but also the things that really bring comfort and meaning to the whole experience. So I can't thank you enough for meeting today and to taking the time to, explain about your work, and also, some of what those experiences have been like for you, and what you've seen. And again, the future is bright, and I think it's all about keeping the conversation going. So, thank you so much, Ngaio. And if anybody wants to find you, how would they go about contacting you?
Yeah, I mean, probably the easiest thing would be to direct people to our website, and then they'll get the email address and the phone number. And our website is KORUcremation.com, which is KORU cremation.com.
Wonderful.
And I just want to throw out there that Emily, my partner, and I were inspired by the work that you're doing and the lead up to this first podcast interview with you, that we've put together, and Emily's put in a lot of work, put together a page that's going to be on our website that'll just be information about MAiD and being able to direct people to resources like Bridge C14. So that there's another place for people to go to. So thank you so much for that inspiration to us.
Wonderful. I love hearing things like that. And I'll certainly include your contact information in the description below the video. And, if anybody has any questions or thoughts around today's podcast, or the work that Ngaio and her and Emily are doing. And, I think the work in the MAiD space, certainly reach out to either myself or Ngaio. And again, I'd love to connect again in the future. And I want to thank you again for taking the time today to meet and to share about your work.
Thanks so much, Lauren. Yeah, I would love to connect again.